Tyler Cowen wrote a book called Stubborn Attachments, in which he argues that we have a moral obligation to increase GDP as much as possible without violating human rights, and while also mitigating the effects of climate change and trying to prevent nuclear war. But the bulk of the book is dedicating to arguing why GDP growth is important. And the way he does that is by essentially doing what you did in Famine, Affluence, and Morality with regard to the dimension of space, which is to say, your argument was that, the number of miles between you and another person shouldn't diminish your obligation to them. What Cowen does in this book is, the number of years away that you are from a person who's yet unborn, also doesn't diminish your obligation to them. And so, given that GDP functions in terms of compound growth, a 0.1% change in the GDP rate will mean over the course of 100 years that the world is much, much wealthier 100 years from now than it would have been with a slightly lower rate. And so what he ends up arguing is that if given a trade-off between reducing inequality, for example, through a welfare program that has a negative effect on GDP, and maximizing GDP, we actually have a moral obligation to do the second, because we would essentially, if we didn't, we would be sacrificing the wealth of many future people for the poverty of a smaller number of people that are alive today. So I'm curious with regard to your reflections on inequality just now, if you think that argument makes sense at all, and how you view that issue, the issue of long time spans in general.
I agree with Tyler Cowen that we should not discount the future per se. Of course, the future may be uncertain, and we may not know what effect we'll have on the future. So we can discount that. For example, Nicholas Stern, the English economist who wrote about climate change some years ago, discounted the future by a very small amount on the basis of the fact that there may not be a future, that there may be a nuclear war, or a large asteroid may collide with our planet, or something like that. There's a chance, but only a very small one, that there just won't be any people around in 100 years. And then, of course, if we sacrifice the poor today for the benefit of the future tomorrow, we'll have sacrificed in vain. So I think his discount was something like 0.25% per annum, much less than economists often discount the future by. And I think that's reasonable, but you shouldn't discount the future just because it's the future. And Cowen is right about that. Just as we should care equally about people wherever they are, so we should care equally about people whenever they are, as long as we know that they are, and as long as we know that we can make a difference to their lives. Now, the other question that's raised by Cowen's argument, of course, is does an increase in GDP make people happier or better off? And if so, how does that compare with how the welfare program that you mentioned in your example makes people happier and better off? And I suppose it would be possible to argue that if people are really poor now, you make a bigger difference to their well-being than increasing the GDP of people who are already wealthy, right? Because if we assume that GDP is increasing, people in 100 years will be far wealthier than we are, then I suppose you can raise the question, and suppose that the GDP did increase, as you say, by that 0.1%, and over a century that made a large difference, would they still be that much happier off? In other words, I'm not sure what the figures are, but would having a GDP that was 10 times ours make, when I say ours, I mean that of affluent countries, make people happier than having one that was 5 times higher than ours? So I think you need to ask all of those questions. but it's possible. It's possible that the answers come out in the way that Karen suggests, and if it does, then there's a powerful case for saying that's what we ought to do. But I just think you ought to be pretty rigorous in scrutinizing those assumptions, because obviously they're assumptions that are going to hurt people, the people who don't get the welfare program. And before you hurt sort of concrete people living now, you need to be very sure that you're going to benefit, although there's a very high probability that you'll benefit people in the future. We've had a lot of long-term planning that has come unstuck in some economies and some parts over the past century or so. So we want to be forewarned about that possibility.